I think in a way the most appealing thing about this character is not his physical prowess or his arcane expertise, but that he's surprisingly relatable.
What, because you go fighting Nazis and swigging whiskey in Cairo bars?
Only on weekends, Jason, but actually although, most of us don't, escape from burning Nazi castles or jump out of airplanes like Indy does, there's something in his stories that I do think we can relate to, which is that in all of his quests, he's always balancing his mission, which is to save the world, against his personal feelings and relationships. So in the first film, as you'll recall, it was for his hard-drinking ex-lover. Then he had a young apprentice who tagged along and another girlfriend. Then he had his absentee father, who in the third film was played by Sean Connery, and in a way James Bond was Indy's dad in a kind of symbolic way. Then he had a long-lost son, and finally he's got, in this film, the godchild. And yes, the stakes may be higher than they are for you and me, Jason, but Indy's basic dilemma, which is work or family, is something that all of us stuck in the office and dream of going home, or perhaps vice versa, can relate to. So I think the darkest secret of Indiana Jones was that he was always one of us.
So with that, then, we'll head to the cinema and we'll bid Indy adieu. Andy, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. The show's editors are Chris Impey and Jad Gill. Our deputy editor is John Joe Devlin, and our sound engineer is Will Rowe.
Going forward, too. This is no longer just an issue of Democrats taking on big companies.
Alexandra, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Jason.
Enterprise Rent-A-Car adapte ses solutions de mobilité à tous les besoins de votre entreprise. Vous cherchez des voitures à l'heure pour votre équipe de vente? Des camionnettes à la semaine, au mois ou à l'année pour expédier vos produits? Ou une flotte de véhicules de prêt disponible lorsque vos clients en ont besoin? Enterprise Rent-A-Car est toujours à vos côtés. Avec plus d'agences dans plus de lieux à travers le monde, nous sommes présents partout où vous avez besoin de nous. Vous trouverez ce que vous cherchez sur enterprise.fr.
For decades, economic growth in China seemed like an inevitability, until, of course, the pandemic hit. Under the government's harsh zero-COVID restrictions, people were forced to stay at home while businesses faltered and failed. In January, those lockdowns finally ended, and for a time, the economy came roaring back.
China's economy is rebounding after 3 years of widespread COVID-19 curbs.
China's latest quarterly growth figures are out, and they're better than expected.
Even housing picked up. Sales picked up for the first time in 20 months.
Now, GDP growth came in at 4.5% in the first 3 months of the year.
Yet, early indications show that after a strong first quarter, the long-awaited recovery has slowed. To keep citizens spending, Beijing is stepping in. Last week, the Chinese central bank cut interest rates, while the government announced a multi-billion-dollar tax break for new green vehicles. But while China's Premier Li Qiang sounded outright bullish at the World Economic Forum on Tuesday, his predictions of mounting growth may be overly optimistic.
So everybody thought China would come roaring back from zero COVID earlier this year, but across the board, things just aren't really happening the way that many expected.
Don Wineland is The Economist's China Business and Finance editor.
It's possible that between April and June, the economy won't really grow at all compared to the quarter before. And everybody's watching this slowdown for what kind of impact it might have on the global economy.
Why is that? Why the slowdown?
Well, if you go back a couple months ago, really not very long ago at all, 6-7 months ago, China was just emerging from zero COVID, which was this policy that essentially shut down the economy in order to stop COVID from spreading. Everyone expected that as the economy opened up and as China opened up to the world, that people would start spending money again. We did see some of that earlier in the year, but it's really tapered off quite a bit as the year has progressed. And it really doesn't matter where you're looking, if it's retail spending or house purchasing or investment, all of these gauges on economic activity aren't doing very well. It's quite a worrying sign for where the economy is headed this year.
And Don, what exactly is driving this change?
There's multiple problems, but one thing that everybody's talking about is the housing and real estate market. This is a huge component of China's economic growth, anywhere between 25 and 30% of economic output. And really, we're just not seeing enough activity in this area. So not enough people are buying homes. Prices in many cities across the country are still slowly going down. And there's not a lot of construction activity happening. And local governments aren't really selling enough land either. Selling land is a really important part of local government revenue. And it's just really not happening right now.
And what's the government doing to slow this slide?
China's response to a lot of these problems over the past couple years has been relatively slow. And that's the case with what we're seeing right now as well. At first, we didn't really see much of a reaction from the government. But very recently, we have seen signals from the central government that it's going to take action. So one thing that's happened very recently is that the central bank has lowered interest rates. The cut itself was very small, but again, it's a sign that the government understands that there's a problem. We will probably see more interest rate cuts in the next couple weeks and months.
And Don, do you think that these interventions will be enough?
So as the central bank cuts interest rates, it's hoping that more people will want to borrow money at lower costs. But, if you're a big company and you're thinking about expanding right now and, getting loans to do that, this environment isn't the greatest time to expand. As many economists say, pushing on a string, it's hard to get companies to borrow more money just by lowering interest rates.
Well, if lowering interest rates won't go far enough, then what?
There could be a fiscal component of the government's response. So far, China has not done a whole lot of transfers to average people. So the stimulus checks that people saw in America and many other countries, China didn't really do that across the board. It's possible that they could experiment with that. We have seen some small targeted stimulus programs like that in some cities, but they haven't really tried that across the board. And they may very well try. So this could come in the form of consumer giveaways. They could give vouchers for spending specifically on food and dining. This is something that helps create jobs later down the line. If restaurants are doing well and they hire more people, that could, have an impact on unemployment.
And on whichever way China goes, whether the slowdown continues or they manage to get it under control, what might this all mean for the world economy?
At the start of the year, there were concerns that a very strong economic rebound in China would drive up inflation globally. We really have not seen that so far. The smaller rebound that we saw in the beginning of the year didn't really have an effect on global inflation. This went against what many people were predicting. And at this point, we're not really seeing much of an impact across the board on many different commodities. So China's rebound has not prevented oil prices from dropping 10%. Steel and copper prices have gotten cheaper. At this point, the concerns over China driving up global inflation really haven't panned out. So I guess if there's some silver lining in China's economic problems right now, it's that we're not seeing higher inflation around the world due to economic activity here. And I'd say that's a welcome surprise for the global economy this year.
Don, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
My earliest memories are always really good summers in Ireland, being taken to the beach and having a pack of potato crisps with you.
My granddad and my great-uncle used to buy us a 6-pack of Tato for me and my siblings on a Friday, and it was such a treat. And the key is to keep it a treat. I have a bag here in front of me. I'm going to open it. Oh, that first whiff. Oh, it's so good.
For a potato, there is no nobler fate than to end up in a packet of Tato cheese and onion crisps.
Just lovely.
Josie Delap writes World in a Dish, The Economist's column on food.
Tatoes are the consummate crisps, or potato chips, to our American listeners. The company was established in Ireland in 1954 by someone called Joe Spud Murphy.
First of all, every kind of potato from County Meath arrives at the crisp factory and then unloaded into the stores.
He didn't invent crisps. They had existed for quite a long time before that, but he has been credited with transforming them. Up until that point, bags of crisps came with a little packet of salt inside them that you sprinkled over the contents, closed the bag, shook it up, and that was what gave it flavour. This all changed after the Second World War, largely because of something called the gas chromatograph. Food scientists could understand the chemical compounds that lie behind flavours, such as cheese and onions.
But these are cheese and onion crisps. So sprinkle a mixture of salt and onion and cheese to flavour them.
Which allowed them to then develop artificial flavours. And that was an advance that Murphy seized upon.
And it's the last left. They're on their way to the cellophane bag.
Now, Tato's also have a mascot, Mr. Tato. And he might not help much with the taste, but he definitely helps with the marketing.
Mr. Tato, Mr. Tato, the snack that has the knack for having the crack. Vote for Tato.
You know, Seamus Heaney, who is one of Ireland's greatest poets, wrote that potatoes promise the taste of ground and root. The less poetic might describe them as a bit bland. But when you sprinkle them with that salty, savoury umami of Murphy's seasoning, they become a cut-price sensation.
I probably enjoy it the most after coming in from a walk on like a soft rainy day. There's something about the dampness in the air, and if I was walking along the strand, you know, the salt in the air, that combination of, you know, salt in the air, salt in the bag.
Some people might argue otherwise, but I would say that Tato's remain the quintessential Irish crisp. Now, they are available in other countries, as of course are many other brands of flavoured crisps. And thanks to a very globalised food system and the appetites of homesick migrants, you can buy Tato's and other snacks in countries that are far beyond their lands of origin.
For me, Tato crisps just remind me of Ireland. They remind me of home. There's just nothing else like them.
It's one of the first things you look for when you come home after being abroad, whether you're living away from home or being on holidays. It might be even something you pack with you when you go on holidays.
You get home, you see a packet of Tato, you're reminded of everything, your holidays, Christmas, sentimental moments, parties and stuff. It just brings you back to memories of times.
I mean, when you look at a plastic bag of crisps that could last for months, years, it seems like the antithesis of a seasonal or local food, the kinds of characteristics that are so often prized in foods today. And yet, for me, they're very much a snack that is entangled in my Irish family's roots. They are a once-a-year treat. I would eat them on a beach in southwest Ireland as part of a picnic, or, you know, after a freezing cold swim, or at the top of a mountain. That's not because I can't eat them anywhere else. You can buy them in London, where I live. You can order them online, albeit at something of a markup. So I could have them on my lunch break in the office, but they just wouldn't taste quite the same. There is somehow nothing quite like the taste of Tato's in the place that they come from.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. Let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcasts@economist.com.
And if you're not a subscriber to The Economist, you're really missing out. Dive in. Get a free 30-day digital subscription by going to economist.com/intelligence offer. The link is in the show notes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Enterprise Rent-A-Car adapte ses solutions de mobilité à tous les besoins de votre entreprise. Vous cherchez des voitures à l'heure pour votre équipe de vente, des camionnettes à la semaine, au mois ou à l'année pour expédier vos produits, ou une flotte de véhicules de prêt disponible lorsque vos clients en ont besoin. Enterprise Rent-A-Car.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Ora Ogunbiyi.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
Chicago is known for many things. Deep dish pizza, its city skyline, and an extensive transport system. But residents have fallen out of love with its buses and trains, and this troubling situation is being mirrored across the country.
And for dignitaries visiting China, there's clearly an unwritten fashion rule that's being observed. Our correspondent looks into why it's so important. First up, though, last night, Russia's President Vladimir Putin took to the airwaves again with a blast of vitriol for what he called the organizers of the rebellion against him.
Однако организаторы мятежа, предав свою страну, свой народ, предали и тех, кого втянули в преступление, лгали им, толкали их на смерть.
Mr. Putin mentioned betrayals and all sorts of national traitors, but he didn't name Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group of mercenaries who'd led what was to be a march on Moscow.
Кто хочет, сможет уйти в Белоруссию. Данное мною обещание будет исполнено.
He spoke directly to Wagner group fighters, saying they could sign up to join the regular forces, return home, or go to neighboring Belarus, where Mr. Prigozhin has been given safe passage, reportedly. Not long before Mr. Putin's speech, Mr. Prigozhin made his first public comments since the mutiny.
Никто из бойцов ЧВК «Вагнер» не принуждался к этому походу, и все знали его конечную цель.
He again said the march had not been an attempt to overthrow the state, but rather to avoid destruction of the Wagner group, and to seek justice for those who have made mistakes. That is, the Russian military leaders he's railed against for months. Belarus is a notionally sovereign country with democratic ambitions. In reality, it's a Russian client state, and its president, Alexander Lukashenko, is enormously dependent on Mr. Putin, who helped keep him in office after a stolen election in 2020. With Mr. Prigozhin and some number of Wagner fighters allegedly heading there, the spotlight is back on a country that maybe didn't want much spotlighting.
Alexander Lukashenko, the longtime dictator of Belarus, is the only person that seems to have come out of this very bizarre mutiny over the past day or two in Russia with any sort of improved standing.
Christopher Lockwood is The Economist's Europe editor.
He's been the person who has helped to broker and end things, and he seems to be the place where now Mr. Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner military group, is going to relocate to. So that's actually kind of a plus for him as well. So all in all, he's had a rather good couple of days.
So let's wind back a bit. The last time we spoke a lot about Mr. Lukashenko on the show, it was after a stolen election, and truly not much since then. What's been his and Belarus's role in the war?
Well, Lukashenko's done a pretty smart job of keeping himself out of the war. Russia has constantly tried to get him to commit Belarusian troops into the war. Now, of course, Belarus was used as a staging post for one of the main axes of attack at the beginning of the war last year. That was the direct assault on Kyiv, the capital, which really is very close to the Belarusian border. But Belarusian troops themselves have not been used despite entreaties, and of course the fighting hasn't really been coming out of Belarus for quite a long time. The one area where he hasn't completely kept out of the conflict is by agreeing, reportedly, to house Russian tactical nuclear weapons that Russia wants to move to Belarus. So far, we haven't seen any transfer, and one wonders whether it is actually going to go ahead or not.
Беларусь, у нас же хранилищ этих как собак в деревне. Серьезно, у нас их было много.
And he's boasted that he has plenty of places to put these nuclear weapons. It's almost as if he's rather happy to be having them.
And you say that he's been good at keeping Belarus largely out of the war until very recently. But what's his relationship been with Vladimir Putin?
Well, Belarus is a small country, highly dependent on Moscow, but it's always tried to maintain a kind of independence, look towards the West. Obviously, that's very difficult at the moment, ever since he stole the election. But in the past, he used to try and play both sides off against each other. But of course, he is critically dependent on Moscow. He might well have been overthrown after the stolen election had not Russia made it very clear they were going to support him. And it's a very one-sided relationship too. Lukashenko has been 14 or 15 times since the start of the war last February to Moscow to see Mr. Putin. Putin's only been to see him once. I think that tells you pretty much everything you need to know. He could not exist, could not continue in power were it not for Russia, and he knows that very well.
And you're saying that amid all this talk of heroism for brokering this deal, that role was probably exaggerated?
Almost certainly exaggerated. We have talked to senior Ukrainian officials who, speaking anonymously, have told us that Lukashenko really wasn't involved in any of the detail of the negotiation, only came in on it at the very last minute, as much as anything else, really, to put his seal on it and make it look as though this was a sort of proper sovereign agreement. But, he has helped to solve a problem for Wagner and for Mr. Putin. And the problem is this. What happens to this private army? The Wagner group did not want to be dissolved. Putin was insisting that it should be absorbed into the Russian military. And this is the fix, that it can continue to exist, but not in Russia.
But what's been unclear from the start is what that actually means for Wagner and for Mr. Prigozhin in Belarus. What do we know about that?
Well, as with everything else concerning this episode, all the details are murky and unclear, and of course things that might be said to have been promised might not actually be, or they might be promised and the promises might be broken. But, what we know at the moment is roughly this, that Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was supposed to be being arrested and tried for treason, has not been arrested. He's been allowed to go with safe passage into Belarus, and that Wagner soldiers can go with him, and that Wagner can continue to exist as a legal entity, but not in Russia. Putin has made enormous concessions in the face of this uprising, because initially we would have thought he would need to follow through on his threat to arrest and try and quite possibly imprison or even execute Prigozhin, who he thinks has turned against him. But he hasn't been able to do that, and he hasn't been able to disband Wagner and bring it into the Russian army. They were required to give them, as the price of this deal, the possibility of continuing to exist, albeit outside Russia. So it's been a big, big, big climb down for Mr. Putin.
Well, even that part is not clear. He said that Mr. Prigozhin would get safe passage, but then spoke last night in very critical terms of the Wagner leadership. What do you think's going on there?
Well, again, another fascinating question. As far as we know, they have not yet withdrawn the treason charges against Prigozhin, but at one point they definitely did have this arrangement that said that he would be allowed to go into exile. So you can't tell which of those two contradictory statements is currently operative or currently the most operative. And equally, we haven't actually seen the Wagner mercenaries moving into Belarus yet at all, so we don't know whether that part of the deal will be honoured. And then another thing we don't know is what the fate of the Russian officials that Prigozhin said he wanted removed is. Now, this is actually really the centre of the whole thing. Mr. Prigozhin had two issues. One was he didn't want to see his Wagner group disbanded. Well, he seems to have been successful with that. But the other big thing is he wanted justice, as he called it, against the two people who he blames for the mismanagement of the war, which has cost very many of his men's lives. And those two people are Sergei Shoigu, who is the defense minister of Russia, and Valery Gerasimov, who is the head of the general military staff, the top soldier in Russia. He's demanded that both of them lose their jobs. Well, as far as we know, they haven't lost their jobs. Shoigu was shown on Russian television yesterday, going about his business, inspecting troops and so forth. But there are endless rumors going around that he is about to be fired and someone else appointed in his place. And the person that's talked about is someone who's actually quite friendly towards Mr. Prigozhin, which is very interesting. So we don't know whether Mr. Prigozhin has achieved that objective or not. That's another thing that we'll have to wait and see in the next few days, I guess.
But whatever the outcome of all of these questions, Belarus and Mr. Lukashenko have been thrust back onto the world stage here. What do you see for the country's role in the war from here on out?
Well, I think that part of this deal will be that Lukashenko doesn't have to contribute troops to the Ukraine war effort. He really does not want to get involved in this war. It would be extremely unpopular with people at home. But where he is going to be involved in the war is if Wagner, as we expect from the deal, continues to exist as an entity inside Belarus, that it could mount operations from Belarus into Ukraine that way, through the north. Raids on Kiev, raids on bits of northern territory, which would tend to have the effect of forcing the Ukrainian military to guard their northern flank and therefore have less troops available to do the fighting down in the south and the east. So there will be that involvement, I think, through Wagner. That's probably what the deal will look like. Whether that actually does happen in practice, we'll have to wait and see, but I'm sure that's the plan.
Chris, thanks for taking us through what we know so far anyway.
Thank you.
For our listeners who have completed one of our surveys lately, thanks. I really appreciate it. Your views are going to help make The Economist's podcasts even better. But let me impose on you just a tiny bit more. We've got a short follow-up survey that will really help us and let you share what you like and what you don't about our shows. It'll just take a couple of minutes. Head over to economist.com/podcast survey, and like always, the link is in the show notes.
Chicago's got what is America's second biggest public transport system after that of New York. It's kind of extensive. It's been around a long time. It has elevated trains, which are very famous. There's 8 lines, and they kind of all go into the city centre, what they call the loop, which is this literal loop of train lines.
Doors closing. Daniel Knowles is our American Midwest correspondent.
Division in Milwaukee is next. Doors open on the left at Division in Milwaukee.
They have buses, and they have a suburban train network as well that goes out to to various suburbs all over the region. But the system in Chicago is definitely in trouble. They have multiple problems. Ridership has not come back since the pandemic, and the CTA, which runs the elevated trains and the buses, their ticket sales are $300 million, almost a year less than they were in 2019. And this is what's causing what a lot of transport systems all over the United States are facing up to, which is a fiscal cliff. Basically, the threat is that in the next few years, a lot of public transport systems across America might run out of money.
Doors closing.
Let's see.
Chicago and Milwaukee is next.
And why might they run out of money?
In the pandemic, people really stopped using public transport. Usership sort of collapsed. And obviously with that, people stopped paying for fares, and so transport systems lost a lot of money. But the federal government stepped in during the pandemic and provided a lot of money, which kept most systems going. It meant